The Jack and Marc Show present The History of Democracy, Part 1.
So, Jack, I understand you've been studying political science.
I've been homeless, so I've been living in the library. I told the librarian I'm studying my thesis, and it's the history of democracy. It was a good home for a while. She felt sorry for me, but now I'm learning a lot about the history of democracy.
I'm not sure I understand the concept of studying your own thesis. Don't you study other people's work and then create your own thesis?
I wonder why she didn't call me on it. I think she likes me.
The whole history of democracy, it didn't just happen all of a sudden. It wasn't just a bunch of guys getting together and say, hey, let's vote.
I think it was started by a gang. But what about the time before democracy? What was then?
Democracy evolved out of democracy.
Oh, mocking people.
Making fun of other people. That was a system of government.
Oh, and that's how you kept everyone in line in the village.
All these things started with the Neanderthals. They were the first ones to mock people.
I know, they're highly underrated. They had a whole system of mockery. It kept everything quite efficient. If you weren't pulling your weight, well, you got mocked. If that didn't sink in, well, then you got rocked. They were big on throwing rocks.
Rockracy was government by throwing rocks at people.
And it was efficient.
The beauty of the thing was they'd all be sitting on, because back in those days, they didn't have chairs. And then one guy would take the rock that he was sitting on, and he would throw it at the other guy.
Being Neanderthals, the other guy quite often could just catch it. But when you're a Neanderthal, this is like playing catch, throwing a softball at one another.
Not everybody was invited to sit at these conferences. You had to be amongst the select few in Neanderthal society.
Came the people who couldn't play. They could only sit and watch. They didn't even have a concept of audience at that time. It came about very organically.
Well, they would sit in the trees around the convention.
Well, you want to be up in a tree when people are throwing rocks around. It's different than like a baseball game. A ball gets hit out into the audience and someone catches with a glove. But you don't want a big goddamn boulder flying over at you.
You had to be skilled in catching rock. And the very politicians, they weren't called politicians, they were called rock-patricians. Those were the ones that were skilled at catching rocks.
It weeded out all the chaff. You couldn't be a decent politician or a rock-tician without being able to catch a rock. You had to be a certain size, you had to be a certain prowess. And if you had those qualities, then you could be in a position to mock people and back it up with some rocks.
A question would come up. What days are we going to have the fires on? How would they decide the answer to the specific question?
There was always the flip of the rock. That was quite popular. Of course, there was always wrestling. Who can wrestle a mastodon in under one day?
Two guys on each leg, and then one guy would try to climb on the other guys to sit on top of the mastodon.
And you just tried to exhaust it.
And the casualty rate was high.
You know, you had to be dedicated to be part of the ruling body of Neanderthal society. And again, it just weeded out the chaff. You always had only the best. I think we should have more of that nowadays. The democracy of today, it does the chaff.
It weeds out the wheat.
You need more robust politicians nowadays. Someone who can wrestle a moose down to the ground in 2 hours.
Who were some of the first politicians?
One of the first was Vaseline
Hound Dog?
Yeah, Vaseline Hound Dog. Vaseline didn't mean Vaseline then. It just meant that he was stealthful. If you tried to catch him, he could get away.
Like King Carl of myth. He wasn't thin, but he had a way of disappearing, much like King Carl.
Yes, I think he sweat a lot. It made him very slippery. The word Vaseline came many generations later, handed down stories about the guy. At one point, someone said, "That's as slippery as Vaseline." Then when they invented petroleum jelly, they said, "What should we call it? I heard this story about this guy called Vaseline. Why don't we call it Vaseline?" He was also good at finding things. What better qualities do you need for a politician than to be slippery and be able to find things?
Look, seeking dirt on your opponents.
Exactly. And getting away from your opponent.
Have you noticed that a lot of the words back then didn't mean what they mean today? There's a ton of those words.
Oh, I know. This is a very interesting thing about history. Well, words came from the past. We've got them handed down, and we've forgotten their origins. The origins have been lost in time. Little did they know that when they're wiping Vaseline on something that came from a very slippery, hard to grab onto, stealthful Neanderthal.
We've just touched the surface, Jack. We're only at the very beginning. What about the word toilet paper? That came from Vaseline Hound Dog's tribe too, toilet paper.
Oh yeah, he called his kid toilet paper because his kid was extremely fastidious. He was one of them who started wiping his bum. That was pretty radical in those days. Who the hell had time to wipe their bum after taking a dump? You probably got some predator chasing you.
Usually you're taking a dump because you were being slowed down by the crap that had built up in your body and you were being chased by a predator, so you had to stop and take a dump as a means of evading your predator. Plus, it would leave a scent to throw him off the trail, out. You didn't have time to wipe your bum. But he said, hey, if I wipe my bum, I'll be able to run a lot more smoothly.
And Predator won't be able to connect the pile of crap that he found to his bum.
That was like a red herring, the opposite of a red herring. When you're in a debate and you toss in something that might be true but irrelevant, you call that a red herring. And that comes from, if you want to throw a dog off your trail, you take a red herring, the fish, and drag it over your tail so it confuses the dog. That's where red herring comes from.
This is another origin of that particular story. And I mean, in those days, think of it. People didn't even know that eating and crapping were connected. They didn't know that words went, well, geez, that doesn't smell good. I hope everyone else is doing this too, because if they find out I'm the only one doing it, I'll be mocked.
That's where hypocrisy came from. The son of Vaseline Hound Dog, toilet paper, he was mocked for wiping his bum. The word toilet paper today comes from him.
And then there's hypocrisy. Hypocrisy comes from started mocking toilet paper for wiping his bum. Toilet paper said, hey, wait a minute, you take a crap too. And they said, we do? They didn't even know. They were hypocrites. The fact that they have to go and take a dump, they thought they kept it a secret from everyone else because they were afraid of being mocked. But then they realized that everybody does it.
You've just given the story. The guy who displayed the characteristic that we call hypocrisy, the first time he displayed it, he was being shat on by a hippo.
They found that on a cave wall painting. This is a more obscure cave wall that they found somewhere, and it only has one cave wall painting on it, and it's this. Before carbon dating, they'd said, this is a picture of a hippo shitting on someone, and then there's someone, and then there's some other guy running away. That was Vaseline toilet paper.
Hound Dog. Toilet paper is his son.
That's right, toilet paper's the son. We should make genealogy charts. You gotta keep track of all these people.
He had a sister, didn't he, toilet paper? Her name was Single Ply Lavender Kleenex.
That was a long name. Most people couldn't remember it.
They just called her Kleenex for short.
It's too long, your name's too long, we're gonna call you Kleenex. What the hell is Kleenex? Well, it's Lavender Single Ply Toilet Paper.
Single Ply Lavender Kleenex.
Kleenex for short.
That's where the word for short came from. It was a neighboring tribe. He had a daughter. Her name was Single Ply Lavender Facial Tissue, which is the more generic version. But everybody started calling that Kleenex.
It got confusing when they had to make birth certificates.
Everything is confusing when it comes to birth certificates. For example, in the Greek town of Myopia, where people were named after numbers, there was one guy that was called .08 and one guy was called decimal 08.
Oh, yeah, big problems there. They all got drafted into the same platoon, and they thought they were the same guy. And they got issued the same clothing, but they only had one uniform between them. Big things like that can happen, big embarrassments. And in those days, everything's scratched on slates. So it's bad enough you got to carry your bloody birth certificate around, and then when you go in to report for the annual mockery, all three of you have the same name. It's all Kleenex. And then they start arguing, no, I'm Tissue and I'm Lavender. And they'd say, oh, shut up. They weren't very tolerant of birth certificate errors in those days.
Well, the Homo sapiens came in at one point.
Oh, they always butt in, and they were not nice people. They always tried to take over things, and the worst is they would take credit for it. If they thought they had a good idea, they said, we created that.
You don't hear much about mocracy and rocracy, but democracy.
They said, we got to really kind of cover up this, or people will think we're hypocrites. And so they said, well, why don't you put a D on the front? That's when the letter D was invented. These are the days when everything is invented for the first time. It's mother of invention, and you kind of need the situation to come up with something, and you think, what are we going to do? We got mocracy and rocracy, then you want to take credit for it, and then someone said, I know, I invented a new letter. It's D. And then they said, okay, democracy.
Was that a lowercase d or an uppercase d?
I'm not sure if they had uppercase and lowercase in those days. It was just a sound at that time. They weren't writing yet. It was just a sound. People to their own sound. If someone's going around going, and then he say, hey, that's my sound. I did that. You can't just take my sound and use it. Some people would get in big arguments and even kill each other. And then, of course, someone else could take over that sound and say it was theirs.
Well, that was K-mocracy. I mean, that was a bit of a failure. He coughed a lot. People thought he was saying a K. He coughed a lot. People thought he was saying a K. And he invented K-mocracy. But because he was so sickly, people mocked him.
That's an example, too, of when medical science was virtually unknown. Someone could be sick and making a sound, and everyone thinks, oh, that's a good sound. Hey, this guy, he's just come up with a new sound, but they don't even know that he's sick and he's coughing. Hey, guys. And then they said, what's wrong with that guy? Who's going to take his sound? I think it was a very fascinating time to be living and breathing in those days. Everything's new.
We have concluded our broadcast schedule for today. Good night.